All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rachel Myrick, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. And I'm fortunate tonight to be moderating this conversation with Professor Jentleson. Can everyone hear me okay, or is there any need for mics? Okay, great. Before we get started, I had some announcements about upcoming events with the program in American Grand Strategy. On Tuesday, February 21st, the event, The New European Geopolitics 1 Year After Putin's Invasion, a conversation with Rose Gottmuller, who is the former Deputy Secretary of NATO, and that's going to be hosted by Dr. Susan Colburn from Sanford 04. And then on Thursday, March 7th, conversation with Ora Rabinowitz, who's going to be hosted by Dr. Simon Miles, again, from Sanford 05. So now I'd love to briefly introduce our speaker. This is Professor Bruce Jentleson, as you all know. Many of you might know him from classes. He is the William Preston Pugh Professor of Public Policy and a Professor of Political Science as well. In addition to his distinguished academic career, he's also served in a number of important roles in government, including as Senior Advisor to the U.S. State Department Policy Planning Director in the Obama administration, where he had firsthand knowledge of some of these deliberations around U.S. sanctions policy. So he is here tonight to talk about his book, which I highly recommend that everyone purchase a copy of, called Sanctions: What Everyone Needs to Know. And before we kind of dive into the content of the book, I'm interested if you could tell us, why did you decide to write a book on economic sanctions? Actually, probably before this topic became, unfortunately, very salient and timely. And also, why did you decide to write a book that is a lot more clear and accessible than the average academic book? No offense to any of my colleagues.
Well, thank you. Thanks, for hosting this, and thanks to AGS and the staff for putting this together. It's a really great question because it's sort of the way you sometimes come full circle in your career. So my PhD dissertation in the early 1980s at Cornell University was titled Pipeline Politics, the political economy of East-West energy trade. It was really about the Soviet pipelines in that era, an oil pipeline in the early 60s, and then the natural gas pipeline in the early 80s. And so when Nord Stream 2 came around, I sort of had my personal trilogy here of pipelines. It's like, oh my goodness. And I'd done work on sanctions, published that as a book. A lot of my academic work was on sanctions over the years, and I had worked, as you said, on the Iran sanctions, 2010, 11, when I was in the Obama administration, and actually when I was in the first part of the Bill Clinton, Al Gore administration, we were working on the Tiananmen Square sanctions that come out of the Tiananmen Square massacre, sort of still President George H.W. Bush was in power then, they were still there for us to deal with. And around 99, 2000, I started thinking about, well, we ran an event through our Bridging the Gap program on sanctions. We brought together people from the policy world, the private sector, and a number of the scholars who've been doing work on it. And I started tuning back into the literature and said, okay, maybe it's a good time for me to sort of dive back in here, see what's changed, what hasn't changed, and what we learned, as well as the experience I had in the policy world that had been an issue. Sanctions had sort of become the Swiss Army knife of American foreign policy, like even before this world was using it, right? And so I decided to book, and then this book, so Oxford, the title of the book is Sanctions: What Everyone Needs to Know, and that needs a qualifier. This is a series that Oxford University Press does of relatively short books that are all written by academics, but written for mixed audiences. So, in my first draft, he said, put half of that literature review in the footnotes, right? And it's a really good series. Sarah Krebs has written it. A lot of people we know have written it. So I thought it was a really good outlet for what I was trying to do as someone who had the policy experience in the academic. But the subtitle is theirs. That's the name of the series. So I've been telling people when I've been giving talk. It came out in September. It's what everyone needs to know, but not everything everyone needs to know. That's right. And then when the Russian sanctions came up, I've been doing a lot of writing on that particular case and speaking on it as well. So that's kind of the loop, as it were, in my own career.
Yeah, that's super interesting. What everyone needs to know, I like the subtitle. So I'd like to start by asking something that has kind of puzzled me about sanctions debates in general. So on the one hand, it see that especially the first generation of academic research is really pessimistic about the effectiveness of sanctions and their ability to compel states to do things. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, sort of this is the default weapon of choice in U.S. foreign policy. So can you explain for us this disconnect, if I'm mischaracterizing the existing literature and/or if the thinking has kind of evolved over time, or academics missing that policymakers see?
It's a really good question. The academic, David Baldwin was a professor then at Dartmouth and then Columbia, wrote a book called Economic Statecraft. So right around the time I was writing my dissertation in the early days, and he kind of criticized the traditional literature and said, and this gets into how you measure success. He said, first of all, unless you think all the policymakers in the world are really dumb, there's got to be some reason they're doing it. And sure, there's a little bit of politics involved. And I have chapters in here, not just the U.S., one how China uses sanctions, one how the UN uses it, one how the EU. But he was also talking about how we think about what success is, right? And he started a revisionism issue, as you will. And then others started writing. A lot of people that did quantitative studies were kind of looking at different data on this. And then the concept of weaponized interdependence was the last 4 or 5 years by 2 other scholars that, interdependence wasn't just how they brought people together, but you could actually weaponize this economic relation. And so it's really a mixed field now. And my own take on it is, it has limited success and it requires certain conditions. Sometimes policymakers, like in a lot of situations, feel like this reflects my own experience. We don't want to use force, so let's use sanctions, right? And they often get turned to as the default option, right? And part of the argument I make here is that when you're thinking about sanctions, you not only have to think about the negatives of other options, you kind of got to do a net assessment of what their own pros and cons are in a variety of ways. So they have that value of don't just stand there, do something, look tough. They can impose costs, but whether or not that achieves your objectives is a different question. But we see them now. China's a great example. We tend to think of China as the target of sanctions, right? Tiananmen Square, the Uyghurs, a variety of things. And they've been using sanctions quite actively in their own foreign policy as well, actually running into the same limits of success as others do. That's right.
So you mentioned a little bit about success and measuring relative success and the importance of doing that. You talked quite a bit about that in the book. Could you talk to us through what that looks like in practice?
So,
and why that's important?
You try to say that there are a range of objectives that sanctions can have. And my sort of framework for this is I talk about primary and secondary objectives. And there are basically 3 types of primary objectives. One is to limit military capabilities, where the sanction is against a particular type of weapon or technology, and simply by not having that reach the target, you have some limitation of military capabilities, assuming they can't get it elsewhere as well. Secondly is to try to change their foreign policy. There, the sanctions are really means to the ends, right? You have to impose costs and try to turn that into leverage over policy. And third is the same kind of thing for domestic political change, human rights, democracy. At the same time, you have these secondary objectives. Deterrence. Well, they may not work now, but we're sending a message to deter further expansion of the aggressive action or another aggressive action, right? Or third parties. It may not deter the target, but others are watching. We're trying to deter them. And then there's the symbolic value, right? It's standing up for what's right. The problem with that is that it's not just declaratory policy, right? And one of the crucial things to think about measuring success is you see in a lot of the cases that the imposition of economic costs does not necessarily lead to success at your policy objectives. And there are many cases in which high economic costs have been imposed. Korea, Iran, we didn't admit, but and so you start with this set of objectives, and if you say, well, let's just say you accomplished 2 of your 6 objectives, you still have to prioritize those. And if you're doing policy analysis, if you're a political figure, you say, well, I accomplished this over here. So you got to disaggregate success, not just based on claims that are made by the leaders, but also by doing some analysis of what they're really trying to do.
So we talked a little bit about how you measure success, and then what sort of factors help predict whether sanctions will be successful or not?
Yeah, so on the measure, you try to do a net assessment. These are the gains you make, but what are the costs you incur? And I don't just mean economic, right? So one of my cutesy phrases in there, I have 4 types of costs: backfiring, misfiring, crossfiring, and shooting in the foot. Not bad, right?
Which comes back.
That's right. Backfiring means, the imposition of sanctions actually is counterproductive, and it leads the leader you're doing to actually do what you're trying to prevent, particularly on domestic political change. Misfiring is you actually are hitting the groups you're trying to help. You're having high humanitarian costs. At the same time, you're saying you're trying to stand up for those people. Crossfiring is when you're disputes with allies, less so on these sanctions for Europeans, but on the ones during the Cold War, the pipelines, there were big disputes with the allies, including in the Reagan years. Or the allies that may be, neighboring states, like on the Iraq sanctions, Jordan, shooting in the foot is a question of the economic cost you incur, and while you can't perfectly quantify and do a subtraction and negative, you got to have a sense that's getting away from the default option, right? This one, I think there are probably 4 or 5 factors that prove key across cases. One is what I sort of call proportionality. Sanctions are a limited instrument, and they're most useful for a limited objective. So, for example, when we use sanctions to try to get Iran to agree on non-proliferation in 2015, they achieved that objective. Case I studied actually with a 4 PhD student here at Duke, Libya sanctions in the early 2000s on ending their WMD programs and getting them to settle some of the terrorism. So they're limited objective sanctions. The sanctions are used for a much larger objective, like stopping a war. They're a limited instrument for that. So in the League of Nations period, the sanctions against Italy for the invasion of Ethiopia and Abyssinia, were a limited instrument for a major objective. I think we want to do the Russian case as part of the problem here. So one thing is matching. It's just like the use of force, right? You need to match, the instrument with the objective. Second is a degree of reciprocity. Ultimately, there's virtually no cases where countries have said uncle to sanctions. Even go back to Athens and Sparta, which I do a little bit, and Napoleon and other sorts of things. It ultimately can increase your leverage for a negotiation. So what's the reciprocity? What sanctions get lifted in return for what concessions? The contrast in Iran between Obama's sanctions and Trump's. Trump's sanctions were much more extensive. The economic costs were much more extensive. But basically, the objective was regime change, right? Obama's were limited sanctions. I mean, they're significant, but they're limited, and he went after a limited objective and was willing to negotiate on that objective. Same with Libya during the early 2003, 2006 period. So ultimately, there has to be a degree of reciprocity. What sanctions do you lift or suspend for what concessions? But the notion that somebody's going to say, uncle, frankly, it's sort of the economic equivalent of what was wrong with shock and awe in about 2003. You don't get shocked. A couple other factors. Everybody says multilateral sanctions work better than unilateral. There's a certain amount of truth to that. But it's not the case when you look at the cases that if you get multilateral sanctions, you automatically get success. Because they still run into what defenses a target has, right? And the targets basically have 3 types of defenses. One is they find alternative trade partners, right? It's happening in the Russia case now with any number of countries, not just China, but India, Israel, UAE, Turkey. Second is that they, contain the costs by domestic substitution. First major UN sanctions were against what was called Rhodesia, then became Zimbabwe in the mid-1960s. There are multilateral sanctions imposed by the UN. And for the first 7 or 8 years of those sanctions, Rhodesia had a sort of an infant industry aspect, right? They created all these new industries, so they're able to substitute. Dictatorial regimes can also do, repression of discontent. And then third is sanctions busting, right? What's now called dark oil out in the middle of the oceans, which is being transferred from ships to ships that were delivered to Russia. North Korea managed to get $4 billion out of cryptocurrencies, even though regime like North Korea has a good sanctions bust. So you've got to take those into account. multilateral helps with that. Last one I'll talk about is what we call is how you affect the domestic politics, right? You know, here the difference is it's the role of elites in society as you're getting. Those elites, and they can be in a democracy or a non-democracy, they're either circuit breakers or transmission belts. If their interests are the same as the regime in resisting the policy change that the sanctions are about, or they're so intimidated that they got to go that way, they're circuit breakers. The economic impact of the sanctions come in, they hit them, but it breaks the circuit. If their interests are better served in a significant way by making the policy changes that are being demanded by the sanction regimes, they can be transmission belts and have influence. This is what happened in Libya in the early 2000s around Gaddafi. It sort of happened around Iran in 2015. So it's not just about consumers and democracies. So you really got to look at the proportionality, reciprocity, multilateral, and how it affects the domestic politics. And those four factors, are the ones, in a policy point of view, you want to put those in a template, and you want to look at the case you have at hand, and you want to do an analysis, much of which you can do on the front end as well as you're going along, and that's going to give you a sense of likelihood of sanctions. Your leader may still say, well, I don't really care, I'm going to do it anyway, but at least you've got quality policy analysis going in the process, and maybe you can say, okay, let's look at another option, right? The world is not just military force or sanctions, maybe there's another option.
So we talked a bit about the kind of efficacy of sanctions overall, but I want to talk also about the ethical dimensions of sanctions, which you talk quite a bit about in the book. Having been in the room where some of these decisions are made, how do policymakers grapple with costs borne by civilians? Has thinking on that evolved over time?
Yeah, it's a really huge issue for the United States because we so often say we're imposing sanctions, even though we're not going to stand up for values, right? And when those sanctions either create that backfire effect or particularly the misfire effect. So I'll give you an example. The Syria sanctions, in the late Obama years as well as the Trump years, many banks, insurers of shipping, suppliers of goods that were trying to get to the NGOs, trying to provide humanitarian relief in northern Syria, did what they called de-risking. Particularly in the Trump years, where they got very aggressive with prosecution, where they were so concerned that they would be accused of sanctions busting and be liable for fines and the like, or jail sentences, that they refused to provide insurance for the shipping of the goods that the NGOs operating in northern Syria really needed. Fundamentally humanitarian issue, right? Assad wasn't changing his policies. And so at a values level, emphasis called consequential, intentionalism versus consequentialism, right? Your intentions versus the consequences of your actions is an ethical issue. This comes up in UN sanctions, and there's always efforts to try to fine-tune. My administration did change even before the earthquake, some of this to try to get some of the aid out there. With Iran, it had to do with pharmaceuticals even before COVID. In Venezuela, there have been a couple studies done that, one, its methodology was questioned, but attributed about 40,000 excess deaths to the Western sanctions, which doesn't let Maduro and Chavez on the hook, but talks about the ways in which, if you're serious about the ethics, European scholars are doing a lot more work on this than American scholars. Sort of surprised, right? And there's some really good work coming out of a group that's together around the Geneva Institute for International Studies and a couple of other universities. We did a group of us did a briefing for the Biden administration, actually beginning when they were thinking about sanctions. We brought in a couple of the European scholars on Zoom to sort of talk about those issues. So that's a real issue, right? If you're making, clean water, or you're hurting maternal health or infant mortality, and you're claiming that you're doing it for values-based reasons, you can't just say I want to do the right thing because some of the United States does that for values. And there's a degree more attention being paid to that now, but I don't think really enters into the Ukraine case, right? I think doesn't appear to be causing excess suffering. In fact, coming in, I just saw a study
Right.
by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs that said only 2 in 10 Russians are saying that they're being significantly impacted by economic sanctions, which gets into the target defenses. But in a lot of other issues around the world, North Korea has been an issue, Iran, Venezuela, some of the African sanctions as well.
So now I'd love to move into some of the different interesting cases that you mentioned. And the first cases that would be interesting to talk about would be the Iran cases. Specifically in the book, you talk a little bit, you kind of previewed in the discussion how you felt that the Obama administration's forced diplomacy campaign was relatively successful, whereas the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign was not. So can you talk us a little bit through the actual being in the room, thinking behind the Obama administration's campaign, why you think there was a
Yeah, there was I was there in 2011, and there was a real sense of the multilateral aspect of sanctions. And there was a sense that, starting with the fact that we didn't have much trade with Iran, pistachios and bagels and bribes, that to have economic impact, you really needed to build a coalition. And indeed, the coalition was the P5+1. It was, despite everything else starting to go on with Russia and with China, they were supportive of the whole deal. Germany got brought into it. And moreover, the credibility, leaving aside the economics of it, if you're taking an action and you can't get your allies to support it, we all talk about credibility in course of positive things. The credibility of it is very, very limited. And a very, I think, sophisticated, deliberate effort was made to start talking to embassies around the world about this in 2010, 2011. Same time working through the UN for them. And a little bit of counter threat. The United States uses what are called secondary sanctions, where we impose sanctions on countries that are trading with the target, where we say, if you're going to trade with them, you can't trade with us, or we try to, American technologies that are licensed to foreign subsidiaries, or the use of the dollar and stuff. So by the time that was put together, you had both political credibility, including one of the rare issues that we were working with Russia and China on, in the European, and economic impact. At the same time, a regime came into power in Iran. A little bit of that transmission to that. And so sanctions were imposed, and then as the nuclear non-proliferation deal was signed, there was a graduated lifting of sanctions. Right? Opponents were saying we're giving Iranian, and some of it was frankly money that we had frozen. It was technically Iranian money, right? Way back in 1979. A lot of debate about this. I simply say that most intelligence agencies said this was working pretty well. The non-proliferation deal in 2017. Not Israeli political leaders, but Israeli intelligence agencies are saying the same. Trump comes in, he comes out of the deal, he goes to maximum pressure, like you said. Becomes an issue with the allies. They try to create all these mechanisms to get around the secondary sanctions. Interesting. There's been some concern. In fact, the former Secretary of the Treasury, Jentleson, who was Secretary of the Treasury, gave a speech about, and others have too, about, well, the dollar is the thing that we have the most leverage over. Not quite monopoly control, but the greatest market position in terms of reserve currency and currency of exchange. There's increasing concern that the more we are using the dollar for sanctions, the more countries are developing alternative mechanisms, right? The Chinese have one called CIPS. I can't say CIPS is the acronym. More barter trade. The Europeans developed one that's going to try to go around the Trump sanctions. Now, on the one hand, this hasn't kicked in yet. My friend Dan Dresner, who does a lot of finance sanctions, says this is a little bit like economists who predicted 9 out of the last 5 recessions, right? But as you kind of go down the road, you're beginning to see the percentage of trade, because the Biden administration uses sanctions just as much as any previous administration. It's still the Swiss Army knife, even though they use it. So as you project 5 or 10 years, the dollar is never going to, lose a significant position, but the number of ways you could get around it may increase over time. So that goes in the net assessment column of cost, right? And you may say that's not a great cost, it's limited to sanctions. And so all of that was there. There was no sense that much credibility of the Trump sanctions. If you look at the inflation rate, the protests in Iran. It was having an economic impact, but another case of economic impact.
So I'd love to obviously move into a case that's on everyone's mind, which is sanctions against Russia. And so in the beginning of the book, you talk about kind of inflicting severe economic pain as kind of like a scoping condition as necessary but not necessarily sufficient. And you just mentioned a study that suggested perhaps severe economic pain hasn't really been inflicted in this case. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, and also whether you think this speaks to some critics saying, okay, sanctions are not actually effective in this case. What should be done moving forward?
Yeah, this is really an interesting test case because it is the most extensive sanctions ever imposed, even more extensive. Well, the anti-apartheid sanctions were global. The most extensive sanctions ever imposed under those authorized by the U.S. Security Council, right? So you have to think of these as having three sets of objectives. Prior to the invasion, it was a deterrent objective, right? In the language of the president and top of the administration was devastating, all this sort of thing. It didn't deter. And there's a real question whether Putin is deterrable, but it fits the limited instrument for maximum objective. Once he invaded, it was really a compelling objective to try to impose costs quickly, to try to, get him withdraw or stop the invasion or negotiate. That hasn't succeeded. Had the Ukrainian military resistance not been as admirable and effective as it's been, we wouldn't be talking about this. I wrote a piece in August saying that we'd entered a third phase, which was an economic war of attrition. So there's a really interesting website that a professor at the Yale Management School does, which looks at companies, what companies do, right? And they look at, which companies have pulled out of Russia, which have suspended, which are kind of greenwashing, saying they're getting out. And it's a survey of companies all over the world, all sorts of multinationals. And over 1,000 companies have taken some action on this, much more so than in other cases because of the nature of what happened, right? He wrote a piece saying, economic oblivion, that's where we sent the Russian economy to, and others were using terms of catastrophe. And I sort of phrased it in August as an economic war of attrition. At that point, the attrition was against the West because the Europeans were paying much more severe prices than we were, right? Higher price of energy shortages. They had turned to Russian natural gas in their sort of import portfolio, probably get away from the Middle East, right? And factories were shutting down because natural gas shortages, the predictions of winter rationing and stuff. Europeans have done a fairly good job of, substituting liquefied natural gas, switching markets. But, as we worry about our inflation and other sorts of things, they've paid a much higher cost. It's swirling around a little bit, but the coalition is in. The question was, would the sanctions kick in over time on the Russians so that the war of attrition would affect them? I was particularly watching the limited military capabilities ones. Those that were affecting semiconductors and things that would go into equipment. There were stories coming out of, kind of MacGyver and dishwashers and refrigerators get the semiconductors. They're losing so much heavy equipment in Ukraine. They managed to contain the costs, right? And they managed to contain the costs. There's some reports now that China is doing more trade with them than they had been before, but China did not totally come to their rescues. Right, some of that was concerned whether the United States would impose secondary sanctions on companies doing business with China. Some of it was Xi Jinping having some second thoughts about this partnership with no limits. I mean, at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting last fall, he spoke out against that. As India, massive increase in Indian imports of Russian oil, partly to get it and then sell it on global markets as refined oil. The Israelis haven't stopped trade. The UAE hasn't. Turkey hasn't. So their ability to turn to alternative partners to contain the costs, right, has been significant. The most extensive sanctions ever. The IMF had predicted something like a minus 2.3% growth rate for Russia in 2023. It's now up to 0.61%. higher than UK, by the way.
Yeah,
Um,
I saw that graphic.
Yeah, yeah. So where we go from here is, my sense in our conversations with some folks in Washington is, um, you know, they're not going to turn the tide. The real question to me is if you keeping up the economic pressure, but understanding that you're going to need it, its maximum benefit is the leverage if you get to diplomacy, right? And these notions that we were going to get them to say, oh, we just got to get rid of because they create false expectations and they divert you from other strategies. So I think we have to maintain the sanctions. But I think we need to be, pragmatic and realistic about what they can and can't achieve. And ready, said to somebody the other day, hope you guys are doing scenario planning for what a negotiation would look like. You get there, what sanctions get lifted, what moves, and said, and don't tell me if you are, because, anybody find out you're doing that sort of thing, sort of like the spy balloon, right? But that's where we need to think about it, right? So they can be leveraged. The question of whether or not they would, Simon knows this part better than me, whether or not they would factor into that circuit breaker transmission belt dynamics in Russia, not so much that leads to another global job. With everything else going on, from the Wagner group, getting elites in Kremlin upset, others, and the sense that, if I can think of a Russian nationalist who takes great pride, doesn't believe Ukraine should join NATO ever, and sees what's happening to their military, having to take weapons from North Korea and pride, and could conceivably want to find a way that gets out of this situation. I think right now what we're seeing is a massive increase to mark the anniversary in the military effort. And Ukrainian resistance, Moldova, public opinion, the Republicans have very partisanized public opinion on this, and the like. So I'm not optimistic that we can maintain them for the next 6 months or a year, either the United States or Europe, where we have been. But I think it's more negotiating situation to not totally hardline the sanctions, but lift them. And it's really a game of whack-a-mole out there now. Dark oil and tankers. What do we do about that? Transshipment from UAE. What do we do about that? And that shows you the limits of even these sanctions for a big objective like this.
Absolutely. So another recent case I wanted to talk a bit about was the kind of U.S.-China tit-for-tat sanctioning and counter-sanctioning on individuals and companies. So a number of instances that you speak about in the book, including Chinese sanctions against retail suppliers, big supplies from Xinjiang, and also, again, the interesting case of the NBA. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about whether you think it's likely that China is going to continue to kind of weaponize their domestic market in the future, and what might be the long-term implications of that strategy and the trade-offs that China faces in using that strategy.
Yeah, it's a good question. Absolutely weaponizing the domestic market, right? Apple sales went down last year globally, but in the market, they reported as Hong Kong and Taiwan as well, it went up 70%. Right? So their domestic market is their equivalent of what for us is the dollar, the principal thing that you do. Right? Some companies are leaving because of regulations and closer supply chain. There's not going to be decoupling, right? That's a silly word that people throw around. It's just not going to happen. But China is finding out the limits of its own sanctions, right? So China has been using sanctions, despite all the rhetoric about Western imperialism, capitalism. I remember to figure out looking at the book, but there's an Australian think tank that did a study about the number of times China's used sanctions in the last 10 years. Used against South Korea over deployment of the missile defense system in South Korea in 2016, 17, 18. Using against Australia, against the health disputes of Australia, they use them against Japan, they use them against Europeans and stuff. And they're finding the same limits. I'll use Australia as an example. So Australia has a massive amount of trade with China. I was in Australia with a visiting professorship in early 2020. I cut short because of COVID, otherwise I'd still be there. It was great. Our kids are growing, and there's this role reversal. Our kids are calling us from the United States saying, "Mom, we can't get home. So we're having a really good time over in Australia." It's like, that's being irresponsible. Get home. So finally left. But while I was there, it was in Canberra. I was trying to University. I spent a lot of time talking to people in government, and they were very focused on China. This is still 2020. It's Trump. And there'd been a scandal in Australian politics in 2017 where China was funneling in money into the system. This member of parliament got expelled. And in early 2020, the prime minister was really called for an investigation of this version of the China virus, right? So China slapped on big sanctions. They did not sanction iron ore or textiles, because those were crucial to maintaining employment. And those are big shares of the Australian exports. And of the $4-something billion worth of exports in grains and wine, a bunch of other places, Australia found alternative trade partners with Asia for 3 points. Did not change its policies. Yet fed into, if you look at public opinion polls across Asia, India, South Korea, Japan, Australia, the favorability to China has gone way, way down. Not just because of sanctions. They're not what we're going to call war, but so they've been very counterproductive for them in that respect. When they've had some limited objectives, way back in 2009, when President Sarkozy of France met with the Dalai Lama, they imposed sanctions against France. They sent a trade delegation to come to Paris, and they moved the EU-China meeting to Prague, right? So it had some impact on France. And after that, frankly, heads of state started stop meeting with the Dalai Lama. So had a limited objective, right? In terms of the sanctions against them, it's the same kind of, I've been asked the question a lot with all these companies that copied with the Russian sanctions, many of those same companies are going around the weaker sanctions. Different set of economic interests, different set of the objectives there. Ukraine seen as a threat to security in a big way. Uyghurs is a terrible human rights issue. And just to name two, H&M, the Swedish retailer is one, and Intel, the American producer, is another. So the ability, and there's been a lot of studies of Tiananmen Square and others, there's a lot of evidence that backfire these things. You can't just keep doing business as usual, but in many ways the sanctions have been very counterproductive in terms of actually impacting that situation. So they're hard to target on that. The NBA case was really interesting. Those of your political science majors probably know that Axel, the commissioner, is in political science. A lot of them do. Yeah, vice chair of our board of trustees. And the general manager of the Houston Rockets tweeted during the Hong Kong protests something like, "Sympathies are with you." Right? It's a tweet, right? And Chinese social media picked this up. So-called wolf orders picked this up. There's this massive outcry against it through social media, and the commissioner, Commissioner Silver's real comments seemed to be like, "Hey, we got too much business there," but he kind of walked us back. He got criticized by the left and the right, right? They kind of come together in this. And China suspended NBA on television for a while and on Tencent. And they started doing it again on. In fact, one of the efforts to bridge was when Kobe Bryant died, Chinese foreign minister, sent the wish to the family and put Lakers games on TV. So it kind of went back and forth, but you could see, the dynamics of that. And the NBA then held its ground. Although once the NBA went on TV, by then the general manager of the Rockets was the general manager of the Philadelphia 76ers, and the only games they wouldn't show were the Philadelphia 76ers games. So they're running into the same limits and stuff. And I think there's been a certain amount of sense of, oh my God, China's using sanctions. Look at the impact. Look at the ways that they've been counterproductive for them, which in many ways outweigh the ways that they've
Interesting. So we talked some about China's sanctions policy. You also have a number of other comparative cases in the book. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Russia approaches its own sanctions policy, how the EU approaches its sanctions policy, and how these differ from the US.
Yeah, the short answer on Russia is in the 90s, the sanctions were most effective against former Soviet republics than they were when they did, kind of tit for tat counter sanctions against the Europeans after Ukraine 2014 and stuff. And there was a differentiation based upon how dependent those republics were on Russia. So in some ways it was like some of our sanctions have been successful against Latin American countries where we had limited objectives of democracy reform. Against Guatemala in the 1990s, we weren't trying to overthrow the government change against a couple of other Latin American countries. It's sort of analogous to that, when there's a high level of dependence and limited substitutability and you have a limited objective. Russia hasn't had that much to offer the international community that's been all that valuable other than its energy. And I think here, it's found that its energy sanctions have not hurt it as much as we projected. But the Europeans have been more resistant to them than they, just like NATO coming together. Now, the sense of this is if the Ukraine war gets resolved with a diplomatic settlement that's acceptable to Ukraine, yes, that you will see European energy trade resume with Russia, not to the level it was before. But it's a diversification of your portfolio. Middle East is still stable. Natural gas a little bit better than coal. That sort of thing. So Russia really. European Union, has in some ways not follow but work with the United States a lot of our sanctions. They took the lead on a couple. Remember the incident with Belarus with the kidnapping of the political activists. Europe is the first one to sanction because they said you can't fly over our airspace, right? Since those planes fly European. Didn't get Belarus to change the policy, but the human rights motivation is strong in the European Union. Where they've pushed back has been a lot of times on this American use of secondary sanctions. And I mentioned the Soviet pipeline in the early 1980s when Reagan was president and Margaret Thatcher was British Prime Minister. And at a time when the British were cooperating with the United States on a lot of things, on the Euro missiles issue, on a variety of other things, they refused to cooperate with the American efforts to stop the Siberian natural gas pipeline. They weren't getting the gas, but they're shipping a lot of the pipe. And one of the things that President Thatcher said was this is a sovereignty issue. It's what's called the extraterritorial application of national law. And so that's been a sensitivity. The Europeans and a lot of other countries as well. I mean, the Israelis right now, which are around is the case, they have interests with Russia. Some of it has to do with Russian Jews. Russian Jews have emigrated and are part of the Likud coalition. India, same thing. Has had a long time military relationship. So the European Union, they only really started making EU policy and sanctions in the last 20 years or so. The UN, in its first 20 years, imposed sanctions only 4 times, and then since 1965, it's done it about 40 times. When it's done it, it's, South Africa sanctions ultimately led to the end of apartheid. It took the United States a long time to join those, and then also reached the point where the private sector was no longer rolling over loans because they saw it as a bad risk with a combination of things. The Rhodesia sanctions, which were UN, ultimately interacting with the guerrilla war, brought down that regime. The North Korea sanctions and the Iran sanctions, having a UN basis has made it easier to impose the sanctions than if they just been U.S. unilateral. So, when you get the UN to impose the sanctions, it provides some credibility and legitimacy to it that gives the United States another seat.
So we've talked about a lot of recent cases, but I'd love to rewind a bit and talk about some of the, I actually thought some of the most interesting cases in the book were these historical cases.
Athens, Sparta.
Yes, I was hoping you would tell us a little bit about that, which I actually didn't know that they imposed sanctions.
Yeah, that's always the first case that people go to, 432, And sort of similar story, Athens opposed them against a smaller state that was an ally of Sparta because they thought it was a stronger economic power. But Sparta came to its rescue as the alternative trade partner and cushioned the sanctions. And there were a lot of causes of the Peloponnesian Wars. Some historians, Thucydides to a certain extent, said that, that the sanctions actually escalated and were a factor in the Peloponnesian Wars. And so, they not only didn't succeed, but sometimes they created a bigger problem. Napoleon imposed sanctions against the British as part of the continental system in the early 19th century. And ultimately, that also weakened him internally, turned some elites in the occupied areas that he'd taken against him. There's sort of was a factor. Well, with this invasion of Russia that brought him down. The League of Nations case was really interesting. So this is the first time the international community, acted multilaterally on sanctions when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, Abyssinia in 1935-36. And it imposed sanctions. But the British and the French would not cut off oil because of their own economic dependence on it. And there was an argument at the time, it was early in the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler, that if you isolate them too much, they'll be more likely to turn to Hitler. And Mussolini had an invasion, he actually used chemical weapons, small his own government in Ethiopia, and the League lifted sanctions anyway. So lots of failures back then. In the Cold War, the U.S. and the West had a system called COCOM, called Coordinating Committee Consultative Commission, which was more what you were talking about before about some of the U.S.-China sanctions, which is really about not so much to change behavior, but to limit certain kinds of goods from reaching there, right? Technologies that have dual uses, both civilian and military. And to a certain extent, those had a degree of success. They were done quietly. We had a lot of cooperation. There was a trust on both sides that if we were going to go after other kinds of sanctions, it would be outside that process, right? And so on the China semiconductor sanctions, to me, those are different than the Uyghurs. They're simply saying, we're not going to help you build your capabilities or your global economic competitiveness. And there was some concern about other suppliers. I heard the other day, I don't know the full story, that the Netherlands, that's a big supplier of technology, kind of agreed to cooperate with these, and so there you're trying to limit the military capabilities of an adversary. And it's a form of sanction, but again, it's not trying to change policy or behavior. And to the extent that you can cut off the product or the technology, you can have a degree of success that doesn't require them to change their policy. You just limit it. They can produce it domestically, or they can find an alternative partner. Then that's their counter strategies. Those have had more success than those without changing policy.
So obviously in the book you talk about sanctions cases, but there are also a lot of instances in which you might think that sanctions should have been applied and weren't. You mentioned some of these later on in the book. So things like 1990 Serbia. So can you tell us a little bit about what are the politics that prevent sanctions from being enacted when perhaps they should be, either in the U.S. or in some other contexts?
Yeah, sometimes it's the humanitarian aspects. But I got to testify in Congress to a Human Rights Commission in October about, not about the Russian case, but about the humanitarian impact of sanctions and stuff. And there are concerns about that. In the Serbia case, when sanctions were finally gradually imposed by the EU, by us, and ultimately by the UN, they were a factor in bringing about the diplomatic agreement that was done in 1995 in Dayton. But another scholar, Peter Andreas at Brown, did a lot of really work about how that contributed to criminalization of Serbian society. That the black markets were so active that while you cut off certain kinds of things, you left behind a legacy of criminalization of black market gains that made it harder to stabilize Serbia over time. Right? Now, I would make a net assessment argument that I'd still say that the sanctions and the NATO strategy was ended before that's at that level of violence in Yugoslavia since Kosovo, but not Serbia since 1995. But But there you had these other ongoing consequences. And to me, that means you've got to deal with those that you caused, not just walk away. But I would take that as a reason not to do this. And the politics of it, American companies have often argued, I worked on this a little bit when I was in graduate school, I was doing a project in Washington, late 70s, on, is there foreign availability? And if there's foreign availability, are we just losing the trade? It happens anyway. And, there's been some foreign sourcing to put things in American subsidiaries of multinationals and the like. So there's some influence on that, particularly when it comes to trade balance. I don't think it's ever been really decisive in those debates. It's more the other side. Let's just do sanctions and not worry about what is a negative assessment.
Is there any concern at all that sanctions are becoming the sort of default foreign policy increasingly in the U.S., or do you think administrations are more thoughtful about the potential consequences?
At the beginning of the Biden administration, they did a review before Ukraine happened. And the lead actor here was the Treasury Department. They're called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, because they do a lot of the financial sanctions. And the state never actually had an Office of Sanctions until recently. There's now a bureau, there's an ambassador, we made enough of that. Albright is doing the sanctions thing. And in that review, they tried to put more emphasis on more selective use of sanctions because they were really losing credibility. Oh, I get it. You're imposing sanctions on me again, right? And sometimes it's like you can't be serious because you're really serious if you do something else, right? And in some ways that got superseded by Ukraine. Well, I think the lessons of Ukraine really, as I was saying before, are going to be even these super extensive sanctions have been limited efficacy. And if you use them more selectively, your net assessment is more likely to come out positive. Credibility, your ability to get cooperation greater, and it does crowd out other options. Whether it's ways of aiding oppositions that are different, like military, information warfare, and the like. You want to give them, again, you can speak to this too, and others could, but I've been in meetings where we just too quickly said, we don't want to use military force, let's do sanctions. Well, let's make that option A over here and think about what its pros and cons are. So there's no question that we use it too much. I think the Chinese will find that out. Less than yet, but the number of cases that talk about in the book, there are very few that are successful.
Absolutely. So I'd love to bring in our audience because we have such a great audience today. So if you have a question for Professor Jentleson, please raise your hand.
So I know you worked extensively on the Iranian sanctions for the JCPOA, and I was wondering if you could go more into the process of getting China and Russia on board with the coalition and how that might have had an impact on the defense strategies that Iran had and maybe close the high economic cost, low policy compliance gap that you talked about.
Yeah, I think there was a period where there's been a shared interest that neither the West nor Russia nor China want Iran to be haven't won. Russian calculation may be changing under duress now, but there's a shared sense for a variety of reasons, right? So you have that shared objective. You went about it in a way that while the U.S. was the lead actor that was arranging it, there was a genuine collective effort in this 5+1 diplomacy. And there was concern that if this didn't work, we might have, whether it's the U.S., probably maintain force could be less resort with the Israelis and Netanyahu, an attack which could further destabilize the region, which would have effect on everybody's oil prices, right? Including China, which is now the major importer for that region. And you handle the statecraft and diplomacy reasonably well. The bigger problem is at home, right? Where every Republican decided this was terrible. And the question was, I know there was a sense at the end of the Obama administration, there had been a Hillary Clinton administration, that if you wanted to continue to improve relations with Iran, you needed more of what some of us are calling a three-legged stool. Right? who were saying, well, why didn't you change Iranian behavior all around the region? And it's like in the Cold War, we negotiated arms control agreements with the Soviets, and then we worked on it. But there was a sense that the relationship could be undermined unless you took a next step. Whether or not that would have succeeded, I don't know. But that you were providing, and some of you were providing the kind of economic systems that you wanted this regime to be successful, where that would have led. And so that was kind of the strategy. There were no illusions that we were going to somehow be allies, but could you reduce the tensions, manage the conflict, and move on to other issues. There was a period in Syria in which Russia was really worried that the Iranians were getting more influence. And the Russians stepped up the military involvement in Syria in September 2015. They had their own strategy, their own concerns there. They were coordinating with the Israelis when the Israelis were going over the border for airstrikes on things that they felt threatened Israel. They would do deep conflicting with the Russians. I think it worked out well. So there was sufficient shared interest there. If you work with them fairly skilled. And then, again, in the Trump years, there was a different sanction strategy. The Europeans were sad in relation to China starting interaction.
Yeah. Questions?
I'd like to ask about, keeping, you talk about credibility of effective sanctions, but I'd like to also talk about the credibility of negotiating relief of sanctions. I remember a long time ago, I wrote a paper at the Treasury site that was about Syria, and it's funny, the background is like, well, back in the ever since Syria existed as a country, we've sort of been doing sanctions on. So how do you avoid, pitfall of just another leader not trusting who would ever do anything about sanctions?
It's a really good point, and there's been a lot of talk about that you need to establish exactly what do you need to do to get the sanctions lifted, right? So every executive branch doesn't like sanctions imposed by Congress. I was involved in a study in the 90s of the Cuba sanctions. Layer and layer and layer, some were by executive order and president administration, some was by act of Congress. Anything by an act of Congress would require another act of Congress to get it lifted, right? So one of the reasons that the Biden administration opposed putting Russia on the state sponsors of terrorism list was it would take that out of executive discretion if there's possibility. And so if you're a leader of another country, it's like, what is it I need to do? I mean, you want to say it like that to get the sanction. In the Libya case in 2003, it was made clear to Gaddafi that needed to end his WMD programs, which we needed to develop. Went in under UN auspices, and the UN went in and dismantled them. And he finally began to settle one of the major terrorist incidents blowing up Pan Am airline. Actually, a lot of, among others, Syracuse University students have been studying in Scotland coming home for Christmas, right? So you have to make clear that, right? And otherwise, it's, and then of course, may also talk about what happens if the next administration comes in and changes policy. But that's its own issue in any area, right? And so for the Iranians to have said, and a lot of other things we're going to run, how do we know that the next administration will change it? It's not an unreasonable question, right? So it really makes it harder in that respect when you pulled out of any number of treaties and where politics are as unstable as they are. There's a real question of whether you have leverage to strike a deal, and then for a deal that will be there for 1, 2, 5 years later.
Thank you. Hi. So in regard to sanctions, I heard you saying that whenever upholding the values of another country isn't economically beneficial, then we don't pursue those sanctions. And so I'm curious, if we're weighing economic gain of a situation over the welfare of the people, then we choose economic gain over that. And I know you mentioned the rhetoric of capitalism. So I was curious if you see that economic imperative as ever conflicting with social welfare, and at what point is the ethical reasoning of sanctions just an excuse to pursue economic gain?
Yeah, no, I apologize if I came across something. I didn't mean to say that. What I really meant to say was on the ethical questions. There is this claim, we stand for democracy, we stand for human rights as a values thing. But as a values thing, if those sanctions are hurting the people that you're trying to help, leaving economics out of it, you have the dilemma between what your intentions are, which might be good ethically, but what the consequences of your actions are. So just as an ethical issue, a lot of times when we impose sanctions for human rights reasons, we have negative ethical effects, right? Companies will oppose, like I said, there are companies that are going around the Uyghur sanctions. The United States imposed those, right? And you'll get companies that take different, again, I cited a Swedish company as well as an American. I want to make this just an American thing. And what was interesting about the Russia case was how many companies took more, joined the sanctions more than in almost any other case of sanctions that I know. Right? So that's really what I was trying to get at. I don't think it's, I can't think of that many cases where the United States didn't impose sanctions when there was a gross violation of human rights just because we had corporate interests that were. I can't think of anything.
Have we ever imposed sanctions for ethical reasons, even though it was not economically beneficial?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, some of the China sanctions we did on the Uyghurs, on Tiananmen Square, have cost American companies business. Venezuela, oil business and stuff. So yeah, there's often, corporate lobbying reports saying, well, look, if we don't impose sanctions, I mean, if we impose the sanctions, some other company in another country is going to get the business, and we won't, your sanctions will still be ineffective. So this is an area, I think, where it hasn't been, there are plenty of other areas from governments in Latin America because of the interests of corporations and stuff. In Guatemala, after a democratic election. So that part of your analysis, I think, fits other areas, but I don't think it's been a big issue for the sanctions.
I was really curious about what you mentioned in terms of the UN and its frequency of imposing sanctions. So I wanted to ask what provoked that change? Was it just a change in leadership? Was it a change in the attitudes of countries? And does that reflect a larger shift in terms of country level imposition of sanctions?
So I should have said at the beginning, thank Laurel, who did my RA, who helped a lot of this work this year, and also former AGSer Lise Bousquet, who worked for me for the last 3 years before she graduated, and we did a lot of research on this book. It's been a great help in shaping this lesson. It's a good question, Laurel. Some of it, I think, is a couple of things. I mean, on issues like Rhodesia and South Africa, those are issues really driven by the global South, right? So in some ways, this maybe fits the point that was made before. So the United States was really late to the game of imposing sanctions against South Africa. Part of it was corporate interests, and part of it was this sense of the Cold War that the African National Congress, which Nelson Mandela's a part, had some communist relationships, right? And interestingly enough, in 1986, the point where the world was really starting to pay attention to Nelson Mandela, the Congress had passed the Anti-Apartheid Sanctions Act of 1986 with a Republican, I want you to get this now, with a Republican Senate. President Reagan vetoed it, and the Senate, Republican Senate, and Democrats got the 2/3 majority to override, right? For that, interesting politics at the time. Because, I mean, in the United States, there's a lot of, I know I was teaching at the University of California at the time, and there were efforts at divestment of university portfolios, kind of like the climate change issue at universities. There were localities that were passing laws saying that anybody that, any investments in their public investment fund. So it kind of came up from there. So a lot of them were driven by the global South. And then I think in the 1990s, we saw the UN at the end of the Cold War taking on a much more robust role. Right? There was President George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev who really, at the point in 1990, both gave speeches and wrote about the importance of the UN. And so the Serbia sanctions, the Haiti sanctions in the early 1990s, the Iran sanctions coming out of the invasion of Kuwait in 1991. The UN was becoming much more active, it was doing more peacekeeping around the world. So in some ways, it was an effort And there was a sense that it was not just doing what, you know, and also the major powers were sort of more on the same side to a greater extent. There wasn't as much veto going back and forth as there was. And there was a sense that countries around the world were doing things that were not just in the US, Europe's interest, that there was a sense of the global South and others that these were important. So as part of that, it developed. North Korea in 1994, and also having some humanitarian agreements in that. And countries like China supported them. China supported them less so recently.
A couple times you use the phrase the Swiss Army knife of US foreign policy. And if you do reading on sanctions, like this term appears a lot and increasingly so in recent years. And there's like a lot of baggage that comes with that word of like versatility, but also potential overuse or potentially like not accurately fit to every situation. So like looking back on your career and your time in academia and your work on the subject, what have been like key moments where you saw these attitudes towards sanctions fluctuate and like key points that we decided to think more critically about like potential overuse of sanctions? Like what has been like some of the guiding forces in that line of thought?
Yeah, it's a good question, Matthew. And I actually, you know, somebody once said to me, well, Swiss Army knife is been used in a lot of ways, but Swiss Army knives are actually really effective, right? So, you know, that part that doesn't quite work, which I think you picked up on, right? You know, you can graph it, and we didn't even talk about, Mr. Meyer talked a little bit about the individualization of sanctions, right? There's this list of entities, individuals, some of them are for counterterrorism, some of them are for global crime, some of them are different oligarchs and stuff. And I guess as, you know, we got into the globalization era and the American economy was still central, it was so easy to do. Right? What's been the reaction in the last 2 weeks to more Russian things? Oh, here's 8 people we added to the sanctions list. Okay. You know, maybe they'll pay a price, maybe they won't, but it doesn't really move the dial very much on the ultimate objective, which I think is to try to, you know, make sure Ukraine doesn't lose another war before Ukraine starts to strengthen Europe. And so, you know, the George W. Bush administration used them more than Clinton did. Obama used them more than George W. Bush. Trump used them more. Biden's at a rate that's higher. If you count a lot of these individual cases, I think there's like 60 countries we have different sanctions against now. And again, Myanmar is another example where the military terrible regime is nicely insulated itself against the sanctions, and some of the prices being paid by the people and by some of the opposition groups and stuff. So it's the availability of the tool, the sense that politically it can send a message that you're being tough, and people that oppose it may be accused of, you know, thinking about economics, but you should really be thinking about security, rights, and just this utility of the control function. So if you graph it, it's been, you know, that's why I think it's important to differentiate and get into more of a net assessment kind of analysis. Because I actually think if you stood up and you said, I'm going to do sanctions here because I know they're not going to work, so I'm going to do something else, you'd actually get some credibility out of it, right? And that's the kind of thinking that you got to get to. That the review that the Treasury people did, sort of moving in that direction. I mean, there's another example where, because of the oil problems that are concentrated on Europe, we started saying to the Venezuela, we want to relax our oil sanctions against you because it helps us over there. And in some ways, that's the box you got yourself into, because, you know, it hasn't really helped change things in Venezuela.
Is there something that you think everyone should know about sanctions, but you had to cut from?
Yeah.
What was in the first draft that you wish you could have included if you had another 50 pages?
Oh, yeah. I've got it on my computer, right? I wanted to have another chapter, 2 things. One, another chapter on the way non-major powers are using sanctions. India's used them to a certain extent, Brazil's used them to a certain extent. Japan and South Korea use them against each other. The pattern doesn't change. The motivation in some ways is the same when we use an economic instrument, and we didn't have room for that. And then, just going into more depth, there are a lot of case studies in here. They're mini, and I think they hold up, but there's a lot of aspects that, that we could go into depth on. And the first half is really the academic literature on how do you define sanctions, the dependent variable if you will, side what is success, and then the independent variable, what are the factors that affect success. I felt like, I paired back there, comfortable with what it was. You could have written long articles on it. It was really more looking at, and I really think it's interesting to see how middle range powers that we use too. And there's also a reference to sort of citizen sanctions, right? So one of the effective campaigns in terms of consumers was years back when consumer groups got together and were boycotting timber from the Amazon forest from Brazil and put enough pressure that first Lowe's and then Home Depot, right, wasn't even legislative sanctions. And so that would have been an interesting thing, how we're NGOs in society. But we had a word limit.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for coming. This has been so interesting. I was reading earlier this month about how Ukrainian lawmakers were calling for the U.S. to impose secondary sanctions on China and Russia if they stop buying, unless they stop buying Russian energy and Russian oil. Just based on your extensive research on this topic and how China and India have reacted to U.S. sanctions in the past, what effect, if any, do you think this would have with these sanctions? What effect, if any, do you think these sanctions would have if the U.S. did?
Yeah, I think it would be very limited effect on another incremental cost imposed on the Russians, and showing, their ability to bear costs. I mean, this poll that we were talking about was actually with a group of the Levada Center in Russia, which is polling not that reliable in Russia, but it's about as reliable as we have. But when American diplomats went to India to talk about this, Jordan made a lot of asks. Oh, we want you to work with us in the Quad, and we want you to work with us on this. And Indians said, of course, they will say, what are your priorities here? What are our national interests? We have a sense of what our national interests are. We've got a long-term relationship with Russia, particularly for military supplies. We're doing quite well, thank you very much, on remarketing the oil. It's a world in which states have their national interests, right? Israel, Turkey, UAE. And so I think it's really a question. One of the great dilemmas for American diplomacy, and I know this from we hear this list, we have a lot of asks, and countries like, what are your priorities? How many things you want us to do? And then sometimes in return, they ask us to do something we don't really want to do, either because of our values or our income. The China fact has been interesting. I mean, there's been some reports. Wall Street Journal had an article about a week ago about things beginning to step up in the China side. But for this first year, they have been much less of an alternative trade partner than many people, including on military supplies. And they too want to get oil. Russia sent a lot of oil at this kind of price, lower than the world price. So that's the way we have to think about it. Is countries have their interests. And, my own thinking, most countries in the world want to have relations with every major power. They don't want to just go on one team. That's kind of what it seems like out here. So when state-run folks went to India, it was constructive discussions, and we, agreed on this and did agree on that. But, India has interests there that are not in it. That's what we're seeing. The number of countries that I think the statistic was we had about 67% of the global economy generally cooperating with sanctions, and 65% of the global population. You begin to see the differences.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Jentleson, for this wonderful conversation. And I might recommend that if you do not yet have a Valentine's Day present for that special someone,
Now you're going to be in real trouble.
here's an accessible read. Thank you all.
Thanks. Great.
Yeah, but what would they read? What would they read?